It's good. Okay.
Yeah, you're good. We're all good. And we're alive and we're good. So, welcome everybody. This is the after show for the Godless Engineer and Wiz discussion that they just had on the Non Sequitur show. I am not putting any links into the video description right now because my last video, for some strange reason, even though it had nothing controversial in it whatsoever, was already demonetized. I don't freaking know. You get this little thing, even if you review it and they say, "Hey, you know what? We discovered it's not eligible for monetization." They never tell you why, so you don't even know what the next one for what you're doing is wrong. It's really an idiotic system. So I'm just going to leave all links out, all metadata out, and see what happens because I like to have at least one video that's actually monetized because it would be nice. So, anyways, we do have Godless Engineering here. We got Wiz in here. We've got Cygart. We've got Socka Count, who's going to be kind of maybe doing a little bit of analysis on some of the argumentation that was put out and some of the nomenclature, because this is not an easy thing to really dive right into, and I know both of them had very little time to prepare for this, or what they had time for prepare for, they did a great job. And we've got Kyle in here, and of course Res Rhetoric. So I think we're going to jump on it right into it, and I'm just going to turn over to Soccer real quick. I just say that if you want to know some of these terminology, because I do think they kind of need to be standardized in the GDC a little bit, so there's no confusion. And I think that both parties did a pretty good job in doing that. So props to you guys. If you go to the wiki, the GDC Great Debate Community wiki, it's on there, so you can go look at some of these terminologies. But anyways, Soccer, you were kind of I don't want to say losing your shit, but you were a little bit concerned about some of the things in the discussion, right?
I mean, there's a few things. I mean, first off, I definitely do not want to be painted as any type of authority on absolutely anything here. This is a topic that I find interesting, and there are a couple things that I heard that I fundamentally kind of disagree with. And the way that they're being presented is that in the experiences that I have had in some of these discussions, the positions that were being kind of espoused didn't really represent what I would have actually, what I thought I would have been hearing from people that were arguing those positions. So, like, for example, the Wiz, like you talked about how the you have your system, and it's objective, but then it's not objective because it gets to a point where it starts off and it's subjective, but after that it's objective, so it's okay. And I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, kind of to put out there. And so maybe we can just start there. If and I don't want to rehash like the entire the debate that went up there, but I guess maybe what would start off here that would help out is that when you consider yourself a moral realist, when you're putting forward a moral realist position, or what is the goal of presenting a system like that?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Okay, I guess, all right. What does moral realism mean to you? Let's go with that one.
To me, I guess.
Do you want to back it up a little bit, because that should be something like right off the bat you'd be able to answer there, Wiz. How about we back it up a little bit to just start what a proposition would mean for like cognitivist and a non-cognitivist, I think, and then we can get into what's more realism and stuff. Because I think that's how it should be framed. If people understood what a moral proposition is, if a statement actually is truth apt, and then if you think that you can assign a truth value to it, or you can't, if you're cognitivist or not cognitivist, and kind of break it down for people, maybe.
Right. Okay.
Socka.
Okay. So in the world out there, there's let's say there's moral judgments. Okay. And if you're asked to describe what a moral judgment was, you can ask things like, do they express? Are they expressed by statements, or propositions? Are they truth apt? And do they describe the state of affairs? They describe the world in that way. Now, if you start off right off the start, if you take a look at the questions like that, and you say, in reference to moral judgments, that there's a moral judgment out there, and we can say that it's true. Okay, then yes, you start fitting into like the cognitivism camp. If you say no to any of those things, like whether they describe the world, the reality, are they truth apt, or are they expressed by statements, you would fall into the non-cognitivist camp. And when you go into like moral non-cognitivism, this is where you get into different, I would call them moral frameworks like emotivism, expressivism, and shoot, what's the other one? Prescriptivism.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that nobody here is a moral non-cognitivist, because that's just a whole other path.
Yeah, let me throw that in there real quick, because I think most people that I've run into, most of them are moral cognitivists. Now, I'm not a fan of moral non-cognitivists. I think prescriptivism and emotivism just don't make sense in any real sense of what these statements mean. If you a motivist would say stealing is wrong, boo on stealing. Okay, yippee.
Yeah, it doesn't really represent a proposition at all. If to say that stealing is wrong is merely to express, like a guttural sound of disapproval, like that would be it.
Yeah, motivism is weird.
Yeah, so we go to like cognitivism. So in that sense, is that as a cognitivist, whether you're a moral realist or moral anti-realist, within those camps that there is this idea that, okay, that these moral judgments represent propositions, and you can say that these propositions, are truth apt in that way, so that the statement, for example, stealing is wrong, is a true statement. Okay, now. Within this camp, so within the difference between moral realism and moral anti-realism is where you get into a little bit of the confusion here, is because there's a lot of different models and kind of understanding of how you can describe something as a moral realist. But at its core, I think that the easiest way to kind of explain moral realism compared to moral anti-realism is that like we've kind of thrown like the idea of like this objectivist, kind of definition out there, where that there's these moral facts, these moral judgments that we're talking about there, that under the cognitivist definition there, they exist independent of what we think about them. Okay, is that they are as true as a math statement. 1 + 1 = 2. Like that would just be a fact of it. Like stealing is wrong would just be true. Regardless of what your opinion on that was, that's just what it means. And within that camp of moral realism, there's going to be a lot of different frameworks that you can build that can that you can use to defend that position. Well, then you go into the anti-realism system, or like on that side, which basically says that no, these moral facts don't exist. That they're everything that we do take a look at is that these moral judgments, while they are truth apt, you cannot separate the mind from them. And so the confusion on this, first off, is that, well, and then the first thing that anybody will probably say here is that, well, how can you separate the mind from any moral judgment? We have to evaluate moral judgments, right? These are things that we're always thinking about. Like without our mind there, how can these moral facts actually still exist, right? I mean, I'm sure there might be people in the chat actually asking something like that right now. And then, so there's a couple different ways that you can respond to that. And I think that what the Wiz was saying was right to a certain extent, that that he's starting off when he's just called it a subjective assumption, but it's not a subjective assumption. It's not just a subjective belief that he has there, but it can be an assumption. So the way that I would express it, just to explain like moral realism in that sense, is that you're referring to them in some type of way that you can make an epistemic type of justification for how you can know something is wrong in a moral realist system. And the example that I was typing out to Steve there, and I'll phrase this to Godless Engineer, was that if I was to ask Godless Engineer how he knows his shirt is blue, you're probably going to answer that eventually, probably by getting some type of properly basic belief about the reliability of your senses, rather than just state that you just feel that your shirt is blue, right?
Well, I would get it from my senses, and I would. I don't know if I would say that I feel that my shirt is blue, but I would state that all indications seem to point to it being blue, And I think that I guess would be inherently subjective for me to say it.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be. See, like I said, you would answer in a way that you would try to ground the reliability of you making that proposition. In the sense that you're going to go back down to especially if you're a foundationalist in your epistemology, you're going to come down to a properly basic belief somewhere along the line. And the reliability of your senses is something that you assume. It's not subjective, though. I mean, I think that most people have pretty good reasons to take these things as assumptions. Any properly basic belief, can be, immediately self-justified, or not all of them, but some of them can. So the reliability of your senses could be one of those things that does that. So if I was to ask you if how you know your shirt is blue, you're never going to say, you're not going to say, well, it's blue because I feel it's blue. You're going to say it's blue because I have this properly basic belief that my senses are reliable in me assessing this. And the way that you can understand moral realists is in the same way, that what you'll do is that if you ask them if an action is wrong, a moral realist, from how they know that an action is wrong, to try to provide an epistemic justification for this, they might say that it's wrong based on some type of basic belief that they have about what it means for something to be moral. So the example that got brought up a lot of the time in the Hangout was well-being. Now, this doesn't require subjectivity in the same sense that believing that your senses are reliable doesn't require subjectivity. It just basically says that you have this meta-ethical view that these moral facts exist, and based on the assumption that the increasing of well-being or the decreasing of suffering can be objectively measured, then you can say that moral facts would exist regardless of what you felt about them. That you assume this at the beginning within your meta-ethical view, that you can actually make moral facts, based on whatever this assumption is, and then you can assess them and measure them objectively at the end. So that would be a very simple type of moral realist position, which doesn't require any type of subjectivity or anything like that. And I think that. Well, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, how do you get around the difference between something that's more physical versus something that's abstract? Like, how can you treat something that's abstract as if it were physical? Does that make sense?
Is he kind of going to the argument of queerness there a little bit?
Well, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, like, my shirt physically is here, and I can see that it's blue. If I'm colorblind, it'll appear a different color to me. So that, like, I know that I'm not colorblind. So that's why, like, I know that my shirt's blue. All indications seem to point to it being blue, but it's also a physical thing that I can take to somebody else and they can tell me what they see. And of course that is subjective because of our perception of reality.
I think colors don't exist. So that's not a great argument for me, for Socka. Socka, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. Sorry, I was listening to that.
I'm a color realist, so your whole argument kind of falls apart.
In the case of a color realist, yeah, that argument wouldn't fly. But then again, by basing your argument in that, like any type of argument that you have to go and appeal to another entity out there, again, would be based off of a belief that there's other minds that exist out of your own. I mean, you can go into any type of epistemic problem here over what
it's hard to determine what is objectively true, right? I mean, I think most of us would believe there is an objective reality out there, but most of us would probably say we don't really have access to that. We have a filter system that we use. We have a map to that territory, right?
Mm-hmm. So in that sense,
examples of things give us an example of an objective fact, do you think, other than an analytical one? Because I use the 1 + 1 all the time. What else would be an objective fact that doesn't require any kind of subjectivity to evaluate?
Well, I mean, and the 1 + 1 would be an analytical fact, wouldn't it?
Sure. Oh yeah. Other than that, yeah, I just use it all the time.
I mean, really, like, I don't know, like that's an interesting question.
I like the tic tac analogy that I've seen street epistemologists use. Like, let's say you have a box of Tic Tacs, and it's got a certain number of Tic Tacs in there. And we can take them out and we can count them. And so, like, the counting, which would be kind of similar to the 1 + 1 = 2 kind of thing, just the counting of them. I mean, that would be objective in the sense that regardless of whether I count them or somebody else counts them, there's a finite number of Tic Tacs there.
And I want to address one thing that 0132 said in the external chat, which was that meta-ethical axioms are different than whether the morality described by those axioms is subjective or subjective, which is absolutely true. Like, for example, like you bring in any type of divine command theorist or ideal observer theorist, those people will be putting forward like a universal moral system, which is also a cognitive system.
Which is your position. I mean, you're a moral universalist, right?
Yeah, but it's also a moral anti-realist position, and
Yes.
that's one of the things I probably should point out too. Even though like I'm trying to represent a good argument for moral realism, I don't buy it. I'm actually a moral anti-realist.
I'm in the same position, right? Yeah. I'm an error. I tend to error theory, so technically that's a moral anti-realist position. But I don't have a problem with moral realism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that the idea that the problem that a lot of people have with moral realism is that they get really hung up in the description of moral realism, because they always think that it comes down to something that's simply someone's opinion at the end of the day. And I see that they're where they're coming from in this. I think that it's just kind of a I think it's a really uncharitable way to look at moral realism. Essentially, like I said, is that if you have if you were to take like these moral judgments out there, and you were to say that you're a moral realist and you have these basic beliefs that ground right and wrong actions in whatever standard you're positing at the onset here, then anything that follows from that wouldn't be subjective and could be measured objectively. So now the whole thing there is that this doesn't prove that these moral facts exist. It just says that basically in the same way that you can make the statement that if my senses are reliable, then I can know my shirt is blue. You can say the same thing that says that that if moral facts are measured by well-being, then I can know that this is right.
Would you say this?
Can I just say that I don't think that that's true. I don't, and I think GE was actually getting to this. It's not the case that all foundations are equally objective or subjective. So the fact that the shirt is blue has an objectivity value, let's say, that is much higher based on what we know empirically than a statement of a foundation saying that, I have this particular foundation for moral values, which, and that was discussed during the debate, especially the issue of historical changes and other changes that occur. So I think it's a mistake to say that all objective foundations are equally objective, because some are much more objective than others.
But what I would counter with that, Sai, is that when you want to start talking about the empirical justification or the empirical investigation that you can put into analyzing something as true, it's going to be predicated on the very foundation that you're assuming to begin with. And now, I mean, I know you've taken philosophy of science courses, and science, within the philosophy of science, is that the entire any scientific endeavor is based on huge assumptions and huge, metaphysical assumptions that you're assuming at the onset, and then you're using. But you can't use the empirical justification there, the ability to investigate within that and say that therefore that that system is true. It still starts off as an assumption, right?
Yes, and I'm not saying you say it's true, but I'm saying you can say it is more true than, for example, a lot of other kinds of foundations that are based on very changeable, very assumption-based ethical or moral principles. And just to say why, if GE is now wearing a blue shirt, that shirt will be considered blue by almost everyone except a few crazy people on Earth now, and will have also been accepted as blue all throughout history. And that's not the case.
I see what you're saying,
as John said very eloquently during the debate. That is not the case with moral foundations, which changed drastically over historical time.
Yeah,
which is great. Can I address that point, Steve?
Sure, but okay, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just real quick. I think it needs to be clarified. There's a difference between ontological and epistemological facts here when we're talking about gradients of stuff. Look at just because there's some things that we assert as a fact doesn't make it an ontological truth per se, does it? I mean, if we believe a fact to be the case, I mean, you don't have to be like a correspondence person to have a fact, a moral fact, because it's really hard. It's really hard to relate moral facts to some kind of ontology.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if I think we're talking about epistemology. I don't think we're talking about ontology.
Yeah,
here
that's why I wanted to clarify that, because
Right.
somebody had mentioned
That's
about
true.
moral facts, and it's like, well, you can't really. There's a problem with relating moral facts to ontology. Yeah, it's very difficult. I don't know how to do that. So maybe Socka can touch on that. But
well, yeah, they do like bridging the gap between like the meta ethics to the normative ethics, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that can be an entire discussion on its own. But
and one of these days, well, just real quickly, for the people who don't know, because they like to know these things. Look, at meta ethics is real simple. Meta ethics is your broad thing. Like if you're a realist, you're an anti-realist. Those things are meta ethical positions. Your normative positions are just simple things like consequentialism or deontology or virtue ethics. So when people talk about normative ethics, there's a difference between normative and meta. But anyways, continue on.
So
out there.
One of the constant examples that gets brought up in any type of challenge to like a moral realist system is the example that you brought up there, Sai, with the fact that we have historical evidence to show the dramatic change in morals, and different like moral frameworks since the beginning of civilization. Early civilizations, what they valued, what civilizations in the like Aztec culture valued compared to what they valued in like feudal Japan. Like there's huge differences between these systems, and while that's a really good point to bring up in challenge to what a lot of moral realists would put forward, there are two replies that I can put forward to that. The first one is that there's a difference between moral realism and moral absolutism. Okay, that in a moral realist system, even if you have like a universalist type system there, there's no requirement for it to be atemporal. It can change. That the objectivity, whatever your standard is, if it was measured by well-being, there's nothing incoherent in saying that the standard for well-being today is vastly different than what the standard for well-being was 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. So if you're using it as a standard, that doesn't mean that you're going to, that in any type of objectivist system, you're talking about something that's absolute, that can't change. As long as the standard is, put out there, that the standard will change as we change. So that in that sense, like, I don't think that these systems have to be absolute. But also the other point is that, when you take a look at the different cultures that are out there, okay, that it is entirely possible that other cultures have come up with different, moral frameworks, moral systems. And on the surface, that's good evidence to point to say, like, listen, cultural relativism is true because we have all these different examples of cultures acting different ways. Well, that's not evidence for culture relativism, actually, which is really funny to say, in the same way that saying that if every single culture agreed that it was, wrong to commit action X, whatever action X is, generally, what people will do is they'll bring the most lewd example possible and put it forward. I don't really care to do that. So let's just call it action X. And let's say action X is universally despised by every single culture out there. Well, that wouldn't be evidence of, a universal moral law either. From the moral realist position, any culture in a relativistic framework that doesn't, does not look like their system that they put forward are just simply wrong. They're wrong. They have somehow made a mistake in their judgment, and they've come to the wrong conclusion.
But they do agree that morals are different from culture to culture, right?
But well, I was just gonna. Is that not like a subjective, like, analysis of that culture?
No, because it would be measured by the objective standard. Now, we already talked about like where they're coming from when they put forward their assumption at the beginning. And like I said, the assumption can be, whatever. Let's say that, for example, you have this perfect kind of, non-biased assumption. This non-biased culture that, only weighs value in what decreases suffering and increases well-being. Okay. And then, let's say that that's like the starting point for every other culture out there, but then you have other cultures that throw in things like religion. you know. And not to knock all religions out there, but I mean, there are some cultures out there that, even though at their core, they might hold to the same belief that, you know, what is good is that which decreases suffering, increases well-being. But then it gets tainted by, you know, whatever other ideological beliefs they have. And it doesn't actually just need to be religious examples. You can take a look at things like the like the Marxist you know, communism in or Stalinist really communism in Russia, or like in, you know, Maoist China. Those systems were, you know, to a certain extent, that they had what they believed was a moral system. You know, they dictated a lot of their policies and stuff, what they thought were actions that were right. But, you know, we can look back on them and say no. And it wasn't that they're necessarily that they were just moral subjectivists or anything like that. They were probably moral, you know, realists as well. But they just had a ideological system that was influencing it that came to bad conclusions.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you're talking about these things like they're not abstract, like constructs. You're
Right.
acting like that they're very concrete things that we can definitely know are right and wrong. But I mean, obviously, throughout time, we've had different concepts of this. Like we've had different concepts of well-being. We've had different concepts of moral systems. And you know, one culture has always thought that another culture is wrong. So I guess I don't see how it's not. Hold on. I don't see how it's not subjective when you are using your own subjective foundation in which to judge another like foundation.
Well, okay, so I'm not sure. I think you said that you were AFK there for a second, but that was one of the points that I addressed, is that when you say something is objective, it doesn't mean that it's absolute. Okay, so like I said, is like you said, the standards for well-being have changed. You know what it means to, you know, be well-being. Now, personally, this one of the I'll tell you right now, this is, you know, full disclosure. One of the reasons why I'm not a moral realist is because I find that like so many of these systems, you know, they get grounded in like the Sam Harris moral framework idea of like well-being there, that a lot of people try to, you know, put out there. I think it's a vacuous term, but whatever, you know, that's you know, that could be a conversation for, you know, anybody that actually wants to defend moral realism. But let's say that, you know, well-being was the standard for what makes a moral action right or wrong. Okay, if well-being was the standard, but well-being changes depending on where you are in history, that doesn't take away from the objectivity of the system.
Yeah, I think that's where the confusion lies. Just because you have to frame it in the framework. You have to frame it with like the goals. So if the goals change, the framework is going to change. But if you have a specific goal in mind, it is still objectively true with respect to that goal.
Well, so I feel like then maybe you guys are using a different definition of objective than I am, because to me, objective like objective morality would be literally without regard, without consequence to how other people feel about it. But it seems to me like you guys are only operating within your foundation that you already have. It's like that foundation is that foundation regardless of what other people think about it.
Right. But that's how it would work, though, because I mean, like, I'm a foundationalist, right? So I take things as properly basic beliefs. I believe the universe exists as an axiomatic assumption. There's no inferential way I can actually determine that the universe exists. So in my framework, I can now have some kind of knowledge I can build from that, some kind of epistemic framework that I can use. So if somebody says, well, you know, hey, Steve, you know, how do you know something? I can say, well, yeah, I know this, but I have to base it on some kind of assumption. So even though my framework started with an assumption that is, you know, subjective, after that, it still could be an objective framework if I still choose to make it so.
I mean, here's like even like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sai. Sorry.
No, I just want to say that I think that John has made this point several times, but I think it's worth stressing maybe from a slightly different angle. The fact, Steve, what you just said about, you know, a scientific framework, scientific objective basis, which then you build on as an axiomatic background, that does not work. That whole system of this empirical scientific system does not translate that I can see into a moral
Well, I wasn't
issue
using it as scientific. I was using it epistemic.
Okay.
Just for clarity.
Well, but the epistemology for the kind of example you gave is not the same epistemology that one uses in moral facts or moral ideas.
Sam
It's
Harris?
a very different epistemology. Oh, well, Sam Harris, I think, is wrong.
Okay. That's fair enough. I mean, it's I just want to clarify what I'm putting out there is not like
Harris being wrong.
But I just want to put out there what I'm putting out there is not like some kind of far-flung kind of stuff. I mean, this is
no. But let me get to the main point here. Is that when you're I understand the idea that if you have a which was stated also by Wiz earlier. I understand the point that is being made that if you have a foundation which is well-being, and even if the well-being definition changes with time, then within the foundation at any particular time, you could have objective ideas. The problem, though, is that doesn't work for moral statements, because moral statements, when the definition of well-being changes, and this is what John's been saying, it drastically changes the objectivity of the moral facts that are based on that changing well-being definition. Okay,
I don't see where that
it's no longer. It poisons the objectivity of those statements. So, just to take an example.
No, wait, hang on a second. But you're using objectivity. You're equivocating it at that point.
Yeah, you're referring. You're
talking about scientific objectivity. That's a completely different thing.
Yeah, the way that you're talking about that is.
No, I misspoke because I don't mean that. Let's take some examples because I have to. Yeah, go ahead.
It seems like you're saying that if a system can't be absolute, like if a system changes at all, that it can't be objective.
No, that's not what I mean to say.
Okay.
What I'm saying is I can understand that you could have an objective system that is based on a changeable foundation. Let's say that this foundation is improving well-being, and that in definition of well-being can change. I understand that within that you can have objective values that relate to that particular foundation for well-being. Fine. But when you're talking about more, and we just take some examples, okay? And the one that John gave earlier was the one about child sex, okay? So if the foundation in one culture is that it actually improves well-being to have for a man to be able to have sex with a young girl, then there will be objective moral facts that relate to that definition of well-being. Okay. So that will include things like, it's really a good thing for a man to take this 9-year-old girl under his wing and give her good treatment and protect her from other men who might want her, things like that. Those are all objective values that relate to the foundational definition of well-being. But the problem is that those also become actual moral statements which another culture like ours would absolutely reject.
Okay, so Sai, let me first off, there's a let's go with child marriage, okay? There's a great book that you should read. Where is it? What is it here? Neil Postman's The Disappearance of Childhood. Just sidetrack. It's a great book. But the reason why I bring that up here, I did an entire show on it back when I used to run another kind of YouTube channel, but what it has to do with the idea of like childhood. What does it mean to be considered a child? Okay, because that's actually been a shifting thing throughout history as well. There used to be a stage where there was no childhood. That you'd get to a certain age and there was no kind of gray area where you're like a young adult or anything like that. You just got to like, oh, bank here, you're an adult. And you see this in a lot of older cultures, even within the Judaism and Christianity. One of the signs example for womanhood was when a girl got her period for the first time. That was the cutoff. Congratulations, at that point in time, you're a woman. It wasn't considered at that point. Now even in those cultures, child marriage, might have been shunned upon. And we take a look back at this now from the modern lens and say, how can these people get married at 11? How can they marry an 11-year-old child? Well, it wasn't a child back then. Was the disappearance of childhood or the invention of childhood? Shoot, I can't remember. Anyway, sorry, sidetrack there. But the idea is that so that's an example where the objective standard for well-being, has always remained consistent, but our perception of it has changed with the introduction of more information. So as we learn more about the nature of the adolescent development, we realize that it's not healthy for people of a certain age to be getting into those type of relationships or to be bearing children at such a young age. It actually has detrimental effects.
Does that borderline on normative ethics, though?
Well, I mean, that's where he's kind of going with that. He's getting into that. But like I said, is that these systems, we wouldn't, if child marriage in the 2,000 years ago, and we call it child marriage by the standard of childhood that we use nowadays, if it was practiced back then, are you going to look back with a kind of like this retroactive look and say that every single person was immoral? Well, probably not. I mean, it was normal for the time, but it was still based off an objective fact. Like I said, these objective facts, these objective moral facts, will change depending on how much information we have going into them.
Just like scientific facts change.
Just like scientific facts.
Okay. So let me ask you this: under this moral realist worldview, is it morally wrong to marry a 9-year-old kid?
Well, you'd have to find a moral realist to actually give actual examples, but it depends on what if you're going to be talking about with most moral realists, like I said, that are completely unbiased, free of any type of other ideological views that have been brought in, and if they're standard, okay, maybe you should go back to the standard there. Okay.
Well, I mean, could you answer the question first? Regardless, take whatever.
Here's the thing: when you give specific examples, like action X, okay, is this wrong? I mean,
why can't you answer the question though?
Well, because I'm not a moral realist, so I have to answer that from a moral realist framework.
But I mean, you're arguing for moral realism right now, or at least trying to explain the science. I'm trying to argue for what the understanding, what is lost in the understanding of moral realists when a lot of people put forward the arguments for it. Okay, so if I was to say that, for example, then fine. If you want me to do it that way, is that in a moral realist system that you have there, you think that it's it's this, you have this basic belief, it's almost analytical within the definition of morality, that an action that is right or wrong are those that work to diminish suffering and increase well-being, while immoral acts are those that diminish well-beings and increase suffering. So then you take a look at any, the proposition that, this marriage to this child, now knowing what we do know about like the biological facts now about what, and what it means for someone to be involved into a marriage, we can say that those will have, effects on the child's body that will be not acting in such a way that will cause it to increase well-being and will actually work to increase suffering. In which case you could say that it's, in a moral realist system, that it's wrong to, engage in child marriage.
I mean, you also got to base it on goals. Like somebody said that they don't know what objective moral fact would be. Well, I gave one in the live chat. An objective moral fact would be like, if you want to reduce harm and promote human flourishing or immortia, then you ought not to kill people for fun. That is an objective fact in that framework.
Well, hold on. So, Socka, was that a yes or no?
Yeah, I gave you a moral realist system. I gave you the foundation, and I gave you that it was wrong. Yes. Okay,
so it's wrong in that, but can you see how they would argue that it was okay or right in their own system?
Yeah, if it's like I said, if something is tainted by ideological views, You know, it's entirely possible for somebody to be wrong. See, and that's what a moral realist would do. If a moral realist saw a system, you know, and if they're putting forward their idea for what morality is, and they say like, hey, listen, when I say that something is moral, I'm talking about an action that increases well-being and decreases suffering. Okay, like that's what they mean by moral. Like to say, you know, that those things are almost syllogistic in that way. Is that morality is you know any action that someone would do that will increase well-being and decrease suffering, depending on which order of priority you put that on. And so at that point in time, someone comes along and says, "Hey, I believe in the same thing," and you're like, "Wow, that's so cool! You believe in the same thing too." It's like, "Yeah, so does my 9-year-old wife." You're like, "Whoa, wait a second." Let's take a look at your system. You say you believe in the same thing that I believe here, but yet you have this thing that I would say is, you know, abhorrent. I think that it's morally wrong. Okay, so now let's evaluate it. So let's take a look at, you know, all the things that we can point to that show that one system is actually not increasing well-being, and, you know, how one system is actually increasing suffering. And if both people were moral realists and they didn't have any type of biased views based on any type of ideological assumptions that they had, such as, you know, like religious or whatever views out there, they should be reasonable and rational to also come to the same conclusion and be like, oh shit, I was wrong.
And if they don't, they're just simply wrong in that framework.
Yeah, and if they're not, then they're just wrong. And that would be the idea of what a moral realist would, is that in a moral realist system is a system that proposes that you can form some type of logical argument for why something is right and wrong. And that, you know, when proposed out there, any rational body would, you know, see that and be like, yes, that's true.
Well, unfortunately, that's not what actually happens, because if those two moral realists,
can I stop you right there though? Is that when you point out an example, what actually happens? That is besides the point. What we actually observe happening is means that it has little relevance over what's actually the case.
Okay, you'll have to forgive me. I'm a scientist by training, so
I know,
what actually happens.
I'm
kind of weird. I just think that what actually happens is pretty relevant. But
yeah, no, I agree with you. But let me ask you: how about you just tell us your moral framework, your positions? I mean, are you a moral realist or anti-realist?
You talking to me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm obviously not a moral realist. I mean, anti-realist. I mean, okay. And as I started to say before, I actually have something published, you know, trying to debunk Sam Harris's particular views of moral realism, which are a lot like this. I mean, he talks about what he has said is, who could ever deny that it is objectively morally wrong for, and he gave two examples, one of which is, you know, for women to be forced to wear, you know, head coverings, and the other one, who could deny that it's objectively morally wrong to subject children to corporal punishment? And the answer to that is, who could deny that? Millions and millions of people.
But that doesn't matter. I see your argument, but your argument's flawed there.
So, wait, because now we get to the point where Sam Harris is a moral realist from our culture meets a moral realist from one of those other cultures, and they do exactly what they do exactly what Socka was just saying, is they discuss which is moral, which is actually factually correct, and which is not factually correct.
You're confusing.
They never get to agree.
But you're confusing objective morality with descriptive moral relativism. Of course, descriptive moral relativism happens, but you're confusing it with absolutism, and absolutism is not the same thing as objective morality. If you're talking about absolutism, yes, you're absolutely right, but you're arguing against absolutism, not objective morality.
So then so then I'm missing what objective morality is in this case.
I think you might be. That's why I'm trying to narrow down. Socka, would you agree with me on that, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, that's okay. The main disagreement that you seem to be having is the idea that in any type of objectivist system that there has to be some type of absolute standard that was always the case. I don't even know how. Yeah, and I think it's science training is the reason for that. And so you, by the way, people that don't know, you are a theist. You're a huge theist, and yet you're a moral anti-realist. So moral realism and anti-realism have nothing to do with your theological perspective at all.
Well, I'm not bringing my theological perspective into this because that's a whole nother monkey wrench. So I don't even want to get into that.
No, I just want to. hang on one second. I just want to make sure clear that because people think that if you become a theist, you have to think one way, or if you become an atheist, you have to think another way. These are not relatable to atheism or theism. I see in any way. But you say you're a moral anti-realist. There's different reasons why people are more anti-realist. You can be a subjectivist. You can be a error theorist. You can be a quasi-realist. Do you have anything that you kind of subscribe to? You can be a moral universalist?
Steve, I have a hard time with these isms and ists. I just don't have enough training in philosophy to know what they all mean.
The only reason I'm asking is if you had a specific position, that way I kind of know where you're coming from, right? I mean, because Socka, he kind of tends to moral universalism, which is a meta-ethical position, but it's a cognitive, but it's a more anti-realist position.
Yeah, well, okay. So I understand that he's not arguing from his own viewpoint. Is that right, Socka? You're arguing from, you're taking the position of a moral realist, and you're arguing in that sense. Is that correct?
Yeah. What I'm trying to do is that first off, the vast majority of moral philosophers, I wouldn't say the vast majority, but the majority of moral philosophers out there are actually atheists, and about 56% of them, or 50 to 60% of them, are moral realists. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, it's not a theological thing, and what I see a lot within these discussions is people, they've heard the mantra from guys like, William Lane Craig's put it out there, that if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Right. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. And so what a lot of people do is they jump on the whole, like, oh, hold on a second. If objective moral facts exist, God must exist. Screw that. Objective moral facts do not exist. Ha! Right. Prove it.
Right.
And the problem there is that's the argument for. First off, the argument that if objective moral facts exist, God exists is a shit argument.
It's called the moral argument. It's a bad argument.
Yeah, it's an absolutely terrible argument out there. Is that objective moral frameworks are there's tons of them, and the funny thing is that the majority of people, when you actually quiz them on it, will come down to a position where they either will agree that objective moral facts do exist, or that they at least agree that they pragmatically accept that these objective moral facts exist.
That's where I would more fall. I think it's more of a pragmatist, and that's where quasi-realism, I think, comes in. But again, I think people make the mistake when they say, "Oh, objective morality can't exist," because they say things about culture or society. At that point, they're not talking about objective morality anymore. They're talking about the difference between moral relativism and moral absolutism.
Yeah, so the position that I think that all I'm doing, like when I was listening to like the debate there, is that for an atheist or for anyone to argue for moral realism is not a bad thing. It's not a taboo thing to say that moral facts do exist. In this, and like I said, I go back to the example when we're talking about the epistemology type examples, and while that one is like I said, is that you're talking about something like Godless engineer said, something that's more abstract compared to just the color of your shirt, unless you're an idealist, in which case I think the color of your shirt would be abstract.
A realist, color a realist.
Yeah, or a color. No, I was just saying like an idealist where there's no material thing. It would be an abstract thing too, but that's metaphysical different shits now. But whatever. But in the same sense that if you're starting off with this like a basic belief, in the sense that that moral actions, that what it means for something to be moral, what it means for something to be right or wrong, is predicated on the amount of suffering that decreases and the amount of well-being it increases. Like if that's where you're starting from, if that's just an analytical truth, that's what it means for something to be moral, then in that case you can start with this objective system that doesn't require any type of subjectivity, and within that, it doesn't mean that the standard for well-being can't change. It can. And it doesn't mean that people that use those systems are right all the time. They can be wrong. And And I think that a lot of people, get those points mixed up. Is that, when you can point to examples where, it doesn't appear to be the case that, people are agreeing in these things, that a moral realist, all they have to do is say that those people right there are wrong, or the people back then had a different standard for what it meant for, for something to be well-being. And as long as you say that, that doesn't take away from the objectivity of it or the moral facts.
That's the way I look at it. Right.
Well, no, but how do you see that and say objective instead of hearing that and seeing that and not say that it's subjective? I mean, it's painfully obvious that it's subjective. You're subjectively judging another moral system based on how you feel or how you have agreed upon your own system. You're subjectively judging that other system as being wrong.
So you're thinking that because you have a mental action within this, that by any virtue of using your brain for anything, that therefore it must be subjective.
Yeah, it's subjective.
That's to say that
this is constant skeptics argument. It's just everything we do is just subjectivism.
Right. The problem with that,
my mouth passed went nuts on because he thought it was a horrible argument.
Yeah, like 1 + 1 is 2. Right? Well, that's only a subjective fact because you had to use your brain.
Right.
You had to use your mind to calculate, what does it mean for, what does 1 represent within mathematics, and what does plus mean in represented within mathematics? And
it's exactly the same.
Regardless of how objective those things are, you had to use your mind to verify the conclusion of that. So therefore, 1 + 1 = 2 is subjective. That's all. Exactly that's all I hear when you say something like a statement like that.
That's exactly what a subjective. That's exactly what a subjective reductionist would do. Everything goes down to brain states. Everything goes down to opinion. The easiest way to defeat her for that is that there are certain beliefs that are incorrigible beliefs that are not subjective by nature. They are true by the fact that you believe them, such as if you're in pain or if you think that vanilla is better than ice cream. These are objectively true facts to you, even though they're subjectively. They're still subject to everything's subjective in that regard, right? I mean, that's what I think Socka's getting to is, you could always reduce everything down to subjectivity, but that's not what we mean when we talk about these things. 1 + 1 = 2 is objective, even though somebody could actually say, hey, you know what? 1 + 1 is not 2. This is what's the difference between the content and the belief of the content.
Okay, look, Steve, if there are 2 rocks sitting out across the universe on the complete opposite side of us, whether or not I'm there to notice these 2 rocks being there, it doesn't mean that those 2 rocks just don't exist or that those 2 rocks don't add up to 2 rocks. Okay, so I would think that if you're looking for something that's objective, like that would be a good example of it, because regardless of whether or not there's somebody there count the rocks, there are still 2 rocks.
But the problem is, but see, if somebody really wanted to get pendant like, they can just say, well, the rocks don't exist. Mereological nihilism. Those are not objects that actually exist ontologically speaking. So anybody can play these games. They can reduce it down to something that's nothing. I mean, it's not, when you're talking about objective, it just means I take it more as it's just mind independent. It's something that is true, regardless if somebody comes along and says, you know what, I don't believe that. Okay, great, you don't believe it. It's still true, and whatever framework you're using. I mean, again, these things are based upon goals and frameworks.
Steve, I find this hilarious considering the entire, like the conversation prior to this was that you judge another moral system based on your moral system, but yet the moral, if that moral system has these objective morals in it, then how can you honestly judge them to be wrong if the inherent definition of these objective morals is that regardless of what anybody thinks about them, they're not they still stand as these moral objective opinions, I guess.
Because even objective morality allows for differences between cultural relativism. There's obviously things going to be relative to cultures, but as Socka keeps saying, that can happen. But that to objectivists, they would say, well, yeah, there's different cultural relativism out there, but you know what? They just got it wrong. So what?
I mean, you don't see the inherent contradiction of you being like, these are the objective morals in this framework, and regardless of what anybody else thinks, they're not wrong.
Could you have a culture that's out there that says, hey, 1 + 1 does not equal 2 no matter what? They think 1 + 1 = 3. You can have that. So what? It doesn't change anything. The belief of the content doesn't change the content.
Well, here's the thing too. Okay, is that I'll tell you one of the things that that moral realists can do that a moral anti-realist can't. Okay, and that is that the existence of the moral realists can say that another culture is wrong. Okay, a moral anti-realist really can't. Okay, because
How not?
It's well, because they don't, because they go ahead.
Yeah, because within moral realism, there is this implicit assumption that you can form, like I said, a logical argument to dictate that something is right or wrong, which means that if you have two different moral systems that lead to contradictory viewpoints, and there is no moral realist system that says that they can both be right. Okay, so within that idea, when you have two moral realists, that are arguing, with each other, that are having a discussion, if they believe that, that there no contradictions can exist within a moral realist system because these moral facts exist, regardless of what their opinions are on them, then you can actually, talk out a problem and you can actually resolve a disagreement. You can come to a position where you realize that one, what somebody said, like I said, might be, corrupted by some type of ideological basis. Okay, so within those systems, you can actually say that this person, two moral realists can argue with each other and come to a conclusion. This one is wrong. Okay. Now, within any moral anti-realist system, you can't necessarily say that. But what you can do is you could try to convince people that your system, is better than the other system, or that is more desirable than the other system. That's the best you could hope for with moral.
Would that be like a utilitarianism type approach?
Well, it would just. I mean, regardless of what, like, what how you get to like the normative factor on this, is that in a moral anti-realist system, what it has to do is at that point in time is just simply convince the other person that your system is more desirable.
Okay, yeah, I follow that.
Well, I actually like that, and that makes me even more certain that I'm an anti-moral realist or moral anti-realist, because what you just described is exactly what goes on in science. Nobody says we have camps in science all the time where, I mean, every field has camps. One camp does not say you are wrong.
That's not.
Nor does the other camp say to the first one, you are wrong. What they do is they try to convince each other that their particular view is correct, and often that happens. That usually does happen, because luckily in science, which we don't have in morality, in science we usually have empirical evidence that will epistemologically convince the other side eventually to do that. So I like that idea. The problem is that when we talk about morality, there are a few of those valid facts that can be used for example, describing what is beneficial to human well-being, etc. But there also are many, mostly gray areas where the two sides will never convince each other. And you'll simply left with each side saying, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. And, where is objectivity at this point?
And I agree with you completely. That's like one of the reasons why I'm not a moral realist is that reason. Like I was talking to Steve earlier, like the reason why I jumped in here is because I think that there's this fundamental misunderstanding of what moral realism is. And so all I've tried to do here is express to the best of my ability, in which moral realism is different than moral absolutism, to explain why moral relativism or moral realism is not can change, doesn't have to maintain the same standard there, and how it's the best way to kind of understand it is to put forward like this kind of like to approach it almost in the same way that you would for any type of discussion about epistemic justifications for any other beliefs.
No, but you don't hold the position that objective morality is impossible, because some people have argued that, and I find that to be untenable.
Well, no, you see, anybody that argues things like, that moral realism is impossible, or that moral anti-realism is impossible, or any of these things are impossible, don't understand that it's the same thing with saying materialism is impossible.
Yeah,
or,
exactly.
idealism is important. Substance dualism is impossible. Is that the only way that you can validate those systems is by already assuming the basis of the system that you're in. Like, it's really easy to prove substance dualism wrong if you're starting off with the position of materialism. And it's the same thing. It's really easy to show the materialism is wrong as long as you start off as a substance dualist.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I think that makes sense. I mean, because the problem is all these things kind of require some kind of starting position, some kind of framework. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people. It doesn't make anything right or wrong. It's just that's, I mean, I for example, for Socka is a coherentist, and I'm a foundationalist. One of these days he might have turned into be a foundationalist by now. I don't know. But doesn't mean he's right and I'm wrong. There's no right or wrong to be had there. Both of them, by the way, all those have problems. I mean, his has circularity priority problems. Might have axiomatic assumption problems, arbitrary problems. So that doesn't mean that I think that he's wrong for having a coherentist framework, though. Of course, he probably thinks I'm wrong for having a foundationalist,
especially because mine makes more sense. But that's beside the point.
Well, sorry, I've got to go, guys. It was fun having the conversation.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll see you guys later.
Peace,
it was
brother.
nice meeting everybody.
See you later.
You're not a foundationalist yet, though, Socka?
No, I'm still working my way through.
It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry, I can't do it.
Bonjour style, like coherentism. I like it.
Yeah.
And I'm happy with where I sit.
That's me. But I think people need to get that, though, is that some of the things are just not right or wrong. If you think objective morals exist, I don't think you're right or wrong. It's just how you view things.
With Godless Cranium's leave, I have to go to. I very much appreciate your help, Steve and Socka.
No problem. Hope you glean something out of all this. I know it's a lot to take in. It took me 4 years to figure this shit out. I still don't.
It's Godless Engineer, not Godless Cranium. They're very different people.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Godless Cranium is the one that Godless Cranium argues that objective morality is impossible, and I think he's fundamentally flawed inside and out on that. And Dr. Malpass is going to have a discussion with him on the 26th, I think, on the Non Sequitur show.
Well, that's going to be good.
But yeah, I'm booting out. See you.
Oh, poor Alex. He was just like, "What have you got me into?" kind of thing. I think he was just like, that argument was just so bad. Yeah, because all cosmic
which is surprising because the production value was really good of that video.
And he's smart as shit. I mean, Cosmic Skeptic's freaking extremely intelligent, but to argue that everything is just reducible to subjectivity, then like rationality rule said exactly what you said. He's going to have to admit that, well, that means all physics is just subjective. All math is subjective. And if Cosmic Skeptic doesn't want to bite the bullet on that, then I think it kind of disproves his argument, because if you want to say that everything boils down to subjectivity and subjective reductionism, then yeah, okay, then every time I look at 1 + 1 + 2 or 1 + 1 = 2, then yep, that's subjective because I'm using my reason, my brain state, my brain chemistry, and it's just individual to me. So yeah,
that's a question, and
yeah, Breck.
And so this is directed towards you, Steve, and to Socka as well.
How you been, by the way, first?
Oh, praise God, doing well as I have been. How about yourself, sir?
Sweet, good, my friend. Go ahead. What you got for us?
Okay, so I'm agreeing very strongly with Godless and with Psy. So maybe my mind is falling into the same trap that you might think, that there's in. So this is kind of how I'm thinking it. So please, correct where I'm going wrong with this. Okay, no matter how objective of an algorithm you have, if you put subjective data in, you're going to be getting subjective data out. So the question that I have, and Simon Godless is gone now, but how is it not in the big scheme of things subjective? Even though the algorithm is objective, subjective things are coming in and going out.
All right, I'll take it first, and then Socka count. First, like I said, you agree that 1 + 1 = 2 is an objective fact, do you not? It's an analytical fact.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so there's no subjectivity, even though my brain states are a subjective system. Everything is how I view things. I'm filtering them through some kind of empiricism or rationalism. I have to use one or the other to gain knowledge. That's how we gain knowledge. It's pretty much one of those two, right? So if I have sensory perception, if I have just a inductive argument, I'm still subjectively evaluating these things, but that doesn't matter. I look at it this way. Let me use an analogy for epistemology. In quantum mechanics, you know that if a spin particle is up and they were entangled with another particle, you know the other particle spin down. I think that's very well established. We all know that. Okay, so if somebody says, well, how do you absolutely know that? Well, I don't have Cartesian certainty of that, but I know that within the realm of the rules of quantum mechanics. So it is an objective fact, given the framework of quantum mechanics, that if I know it's spin up, the other one has to be spin down. So when you start getting into this, what about absolute reality? What about the terrain, so to speak, rather than the map? What about the objective reality that we have no access to? Well, so what? We don't evaluate things from that. We always have some kind of framework we're dealing with, and I see morals very similarly that way. Socka, you want to say something on that, or do you think I'm hosed on that analogy?
I think that what it would come to is something like that every single rational person with the same amount of knowledge, would come to the same conclusion based off this.
I just disagree with that, but go ahead and continue.
Right. Okay. Is that there? Whatever your argument would be for that, whether you want to risk going to the naturalistic fallacy here. That's that we are designed in such a way to value these things. I wouldn't go that way. This is again really hard for me to argue for some of these positions. That's why I don't hold these positions, but just kind of an understanding of them.
Right. I get you.
But it's like that if you are a moral realist, you're going to be putting forward this idea that any rational person with kind of the same the same scope of knowledge will come to the same conclusion, of this based on what the moral facts are. So when you see that these things go into these different systems and people come out with different answers because of it, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily subjective. It just means that some people might not have access to the full scope of information to come to what the objective answer is.
Right. That's a good way to put it. Right. They're limited. They're limited in their knowledge. They may not realize that it's objective, but they're only seeing a part of from what they know, because they don't have all the information.
Okay, well, this is where I would disagree with that statement. Okay, say that you take someone who's a classically trained guitarist, for example, and say you take someone who's an Olympic sprinter, okay, and you pose them the option, what would be better to have happen? To have a brick crush your hand or to have a brick crush your feet? They're going to have different subjective views of what would be a more horrible thing to have happen.
Okay, but what's your goal? If you have a goal that you want to enter in a foot race one of these days, then you ought not to harm your feet. That'd be an objective fact, right? I mean, I think you're appealing now. You're switching now into normative ethics, and you're talking about consequentialism now. What should I have my feet, or should I have my hands? What's the consequences of each?
It's also the way to look at it would be to take a look at the not to take them as like the same type of moral proposition. What's more right or what's more wrong in that situation? It's that every single person, every single rational person with the same scope of information would view the crushing of a sprinter's legs as something that would be maybe measurably more immoral than crushing his hands, and vice versa. And if the proposition was crushing, a classical trained pianist's hand, every rational person with the same scope of information would say that would be more immoral to crush his hands rather than his knees. Both of them would be perceived as immoral actions, but every single rational person with the same scope of information would infer then in one case that you can see that there's a spectrum of what would be considered more immoral in those situations.
Yeah, see how that works?
So that would actually validate the moral objectivity view of this thing, that every rational person, any rational person here with the same scope of knowledge can easily see that an action that would crush somebody, that would hurt somebody in a way that would affect their livelihood would be deemed as more immoral than the other. So that would actually be an argument for moral objectivity.
Could you give it?
Okay, yeah.
Everybody keeps hang on one second, because everybody keeps asking for moral facts. I keep giving you them, and they keep saying, "Well, what's a moral fact?" Again, an objective moral fact would be if you want to limit harm and promote flourishing and amoia, which is Greek for I think I pronounced it right, for means human flourishing, then you ought not to kill people for fun. That is an objective moral fact given those parameters.
Okay, so
wait 1 sec.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Would you agree that that is an example of an objective moral fact?
Yeah, I would say that an objective moral fact, then, if somebody was asked for an objective moral fact, all you pretty much would have to do is just define what you'd mean by how you would diagnose any action as right or wrong, and be like, anything that follows from that would be moral facts.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. That's how I would do it. Just a good way to put it, very succinct. So does that make sense, Barack?
Yes,
You're just defining what's right or wrong, then anything that flows from that's going to be objectively right or wrong.
Yes, I fully understand what you're getting, and I do agree. But then here's the caveat, though, and I think this is what G was trying to get at, and signed. If I'm misrepresenting any of you guys, please, correct me on this. Is that obviously there is a subjective component going on in this, in regards with the pianist and in regards with the sprinter. Okay, both of them. If everyone, like you said, if they all have, the same understanding, such, they're going to come to the same conclusion, and it's going to be conditional for the sprinter. What's going to be in their best interest is going to be different from the classical pianist. Okay, so now let's back up to the example that was given in terms of a culture, in a different geographical region than us in a different time frame, like say in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, compared to us today. Who are we to say that we are in the right and they're in the wrong? We believe we're in the right. We believe they're in the wrong, but that belief is subjective. Just like that pianist is going to be like, yeah, it's worse to have your fingers crushed than to have your feet crushed. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of arrogant for us to think that we today are the ones who have it correct. And that belief is where the subjectivity is coming in. Does that make sense how I said that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point. And this is where we retroactively take knowledge away from things. Is that, like, if you go back to, like the claim, like, 3,000 years ago, denizens of Earth believed that it was flat. Okay. We say that they believed it was flat. We don't say that they knew it was flat.
Right.
We say that we believed it. Even if back then, if you were to go back then, they would say that, oh yeah, of course I know that the world is flat. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We retroactively take away that knowledge because we know that the world's not flat. Okay.
By the way, I have a blog on this that I'll put in the live chat. It's called the Principle of Attribution and Retraction. Is exactly what he's talking about. That I wrote a blog on. That you never say that you knowledge can never be false. So you can be mistaken in your belief, but
Mm-hmm.
you can never be mistaken to have false knowledge. Either you have knowledge or you don't. You don't go back and change it. So if I say, hey, I believed yesterday this was true, but I found out I was wrong, that can happen. But if you say, I know this today, and then tomorrow, you don't say you didn't have you change your knowledge. You say that you didn't have knowledge at the time. You can change your beliefs, but knowledge doesn't change. Knowledge always has to be true, always. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have it, you were wrong about your belief about having knowledge.
Right. So, like, for example, like human sacrifice was something that was practiced all the time. We look back at this and say human sacrifice is immoral. We would never act in that such a way. But that's given the knowledge that we have now. We now know that, taking somebody up to the top of an Aztec tower and ripping out their heart is not going to increase the harvest. Okay. But back then, they knew that that was a moral act to do. That was something that they needed to do because it would lead to the greater prospering for the people. Their moral framework was, in that case, would have been corrupted by, like I said, like a certain ideological or religious view that they had. Now, we go back and we can say that they were wrong, but we can only say we're wrong by virtue of the fact that we know now that the act that they thought they were engaging in, did not actually produce the moral outcome that they thought they were. So that's how we take it away there. But for them, they believed it was true.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What you're saying then is, I think, is that when there is knowledge that really goes to point to one moral view being correct and the other one being incorrect, for example, the example you just gave, which is a great example, when that occurs, then it's perfectly correct for one group to say, you are wrong and here's why, and give the evidence which you just gave. But my problem is, the question is, how often this, in other words, that happens occasionally. But I think that in many, or if not most, moral issues, you don't have that kind of evidence, because I could give evidence, for example, going back to John, Godless Engineer's example of childhood marriage. I would give evidence that this is objectively damaging to the physical and mental status of the girl. But that knowledge, that factual information, objective information that I have, could be countered by similar arguments of the benefit that this act might have for the family of the girl, for the man himself, for all kinds of other things. So when you're talking about most moral questions, we don't have that kind of nice fine line that we have, for example, with the sacrifice issue, where, obviously the crops are not getting better when you kill people. So, and that's the gray area, where all of a sudden you're left with subjectivity, and you're left with cultural norms that determine what your subject. It's not just how much knowledge you have, it's what your cultural influences are. So, that's not something that can be easily countered by increasing knowledge.
And if I can add on to that, you have the issue of maybe we're wrong about them being wrong. So an example that's a little bit more benign, trans fats. A long time ago, not that long ago, but a few decades ago, it was taught that saturated fats were bad for you. Fats are horrible and trans fats are good. So we were, for many decades, we were consuming trans fats, thinking that we knew better than the people in the past. But then we found out, like, oh, crap, no, we were wrong about being wrong. And actually, trans fats are a lot worse than saturated fats. And that saturated fats are actually healthy.
They're bad for you, but they tasted so good.
But you see what I mean, though? That, we were wrong about being wrong. So that's where I'm getting to the arrogance.
Yeah, and if you're wrong about being wrong, you basically end up where you started, I guess. But I mean, you just never had correct knowledge. That's all. Your knowledge wasn't wrong, because knowledge can't be wrong.
Yeah,
that's my point. That's my point.
No, I know, and it's a great point.
Yeah, you make a point.
It's a great point. Is that but regardless of whether or not, so I don't think that anybody would deny that we have an epistemic limitation, in this. So that if it was the case that moral facts did exist, that moral realists are right. Okay, let's just say,
you can be a moral anti-realist and you still accept moral facts exist. You just
right. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. True. Okay. So let's just say that the moral realist, metaethical view is correct. All right. That would just to say that you'd have to have a certain level of omniscience to truly know what was moral or immoral. Everything up to that, would have to be justified. There'd be certainly an epistemic limitation to getting to that point. But that epistemic limitation, I don't think that anybody would argue for. Even moral realists wouldn't argue that they have the certain limitations. But having epistemic limitations doesn't limit science from going out and trying to make objective declarations about the state of reality. So why would it do the same thing for any moral realist? That's
a good point. That's a good point. It shouldn't be an inhibiting factor.
Right. It's one of those cases that certainty is not required within a moral realist system.
And I think that's where Sai as a scientist, I think scientists always like to have certainty, but they realize there is no such real thing. It's kind of a fake certainty. I mean, even in quantum mechanics, one thing, another, but you never have full epistemic certainty. It's always still going to be.
Of course, that's true.
Yeah. So I mean
the uncertainty principle is in quantum mechanics. So of course, uncertainty has been elevated to a basic law of science.
Yeah, exactly. The only thing here's the paradox, Sai. Here's the paradox. The only thing we can be certain about is that everything is uncertain. How does that work?
Yeah. Everything is not uncertain. That's not quite right. But
okay,
there
how about
is,
this? The only thing we can be certain about is
uncertainty.
that there's uncertainty in everything. I don't know.
There could be, yeah. But anyway, I just have to say I got to go too.
Yeah, I'm
so,
going to be ending this too. But
I
Shannon has a
learned a
question
lot,
to
so
ask.
I really got to thank you for both Steve and Socka for educating me on a lot of stuff, because this is all new to me. So
But just don't take me to Cy or I as expert on this. We've just been doing this for a very long time.
That's good enough.
Kind of like fine-tuned, but we're not experts. But I think we've done this enough where Socka and I, we don't really like have the experts go, God damn it, you people stupid. They don't really do that to us. So
you know what? It's funny, Cy, because at the end of the day, even after saying all this, if you were to ask me, like some of these questions, my answer is probably still going to be like, I don't know. Like,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. A lot of this is not right or wrong. It's just your positions on thing, and I wish people would understand that more. Because they say, "Oh, you're wrong on this," or "Objective morality is wrong." Blah blah. It's like don't that drives me nuts, because there's just no such thing as right or wrong in a lot of these positions. Like if you're a materialist or you're a dual property, whatever. I mean, how are you going to make the difference? Determine whether one or the other's true? You can't sometimes.
Right.
Or they're just positions and propositions. Yep, thank you, Cy.
Okay.
So Shannon has a question for you, Socka. But again, let me reiterate on that. Look, if a person says, "Look, I don't believe moral propositions exist. I'm gonna adhere to prescriptivism." There's no objective way to look at them and go, "Oh, well, you're wrong on that." And prescriptivism is just saying, "Hey, stealing is wrong," means don't steal. That's just their way of looking at it. That's their framework. There's nothing written in the fabric of universe that says, "Oh, you can't be a prescriptivist," which is a non-cognitive position. But Shannon wants to know, and I think this is a great question. I think it's difficult to answer, but maybe you'll give it a shot. She says, there are objective ways to achieve a desired outcome. Is there an objective way to determine what outcome should be strived for and why? And I just think that the outcome should be based on whatever your goal is.
Man. Yeah, that is a good question. Like,
great question. Yeah, smart.
So
for thought.
Yeah, so the desired outcome, like, and that is like right up there with like whether or not we're actually ever striving for like some type of utopia, some type of I think eudaimonia is how I pronounce it.
Eudaimonia.
Yeah, eudaimonia.
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 Eudaimonia. No, eudaimonia. Yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, and so within that sense is that like, okay, great. So we have this, objective framework. Awesome, great. So now we're going to try to get to the outcome. And we want this perfect utopia. All right. So what is a perfect utopia? And that's
a difficult question.
And it's a completely different question than like the moral question, because I would say that there's no such thing as a perfect utopia. Which would again mean like, I mean, how would you again, one of the reasons why I'm not a moral realist in this sense is that because I don't think that there is a stage of eudaimonia. I don't think that there is this perfect utopia that we're trying to get to, because the desired outcome is always so, I don't know, like it's
right. But the point is, if you accept eudaimonia and you accept that premise, then objective morality falls from there.
I mean, if you have a goal, like if there is actually a goal, if somebody puts forward like this perfect system out there, then I don't think that moral objectivism would even be, or moral realism would even be a point to argue at that point in time.
Well, and you wouldn't even have to accept the goal, though. You just have to accept the premise at the goal. If I say, look, I don't accept that you can reach some kind of nirvana thing, perfect society. I don't think human flourishing could be some kind of perfected. But if you did accept that, right, then the goal would be this. But you don't have to accept it for yourself to say, yeah, given this, then why you ought to do that. I don't think that you actually have to say, well, I believe that you can reach that state, therefore this. No, you could step out of that and take more of a epistemically higher vantage point and say, well, yeah, I don't think that's possible. But if you did, then this is what you ought to do.
Like like Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan talked about the state of the state of war or the state of nature, shoot, I can't remember how he defined it. But essentially, like the natural state of things, and in his viewpoint, the natural state of things was this terrible place where people steal, murder, whatever. Like you do whatever you need to do as an individual to survive, and he viewed that as the natural state of things, and he viewed us coming together within social groups to try to work together as kind of a strength of us being a rational species.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so within that is that even type of that's I think that like the desired outcome in a case like that would be just not us to revert to this this state of war, this state,
so you ought not to go to war.
Essentially to stay away from what the natural, because you take a look at like the animal world, you take a look at animals by their very nature, are defined by the fact that they have to, consume other living things to survive. Like that's just,
yeah, well, it's an objective fact. If you want to survive, you have to eat, right?
Yeah, that's a biological fact. But
no matter what anybody thinks about that, whether you're, I'm a subjectivist, I think that that's not true. It doesn't matter. The content is a fact.
Yeah, so like that's just like the natural state of things. I mean, that's just what it is. So like that would be. I mean, when you take a look at like living organisms and what we're striving to do, like in that sense, is that I think that like arguments from like the teleology that like it's like, oh yeah, there's the human nature is by virtue it's good and we should be striving to cultivate those things. I don't think that.
I don't mind some kind of I don't mind there's some theological arguments. There's some that are okay, but because I think in some ways there are legitimate theological arguments. But Shannon she says this. Maybe you can address it, because I think this again what she's saying, but I think they have a category error, and maybe you can help me suss this out. She says, "How do we get to the point where we ought, if we can't find an objective way?" Oh, I'm gonna phrase again. How do we get to the point of quote we ought, if we can't find an objective way to do that which follows is worth fuck all? In other words, I think she's saying, how do we know what we're supposed to do? How do we find an objective way to determine what the goal should be? And I think that's an entirely different question and irrelevant to if you do have a goal, then objective morality comes from that goal. But what those goals are, that's a totally different question. That can be completely subjective. How do you view that?
Yeah, I think that there could be a certain nature of subjectivity to that, but I think that in that sense, like I would just say that the goal would be, and I think that what most people would point to would be that the goal is how best to cultivate behaviors that allow us to live, within a close social group and not fall victim to any type of anything that would diminish the well-being of our own lives. Essentially, what are the reasons will always be selfish, but the only reason why we talk about morality is because we are a social species. If we weren't a social species, there'd be no need to talk about morality because we wouldn't care. So because we are a social species, and even within the scope of being a social species, that everything that we do is actually selfish. People think that that by virtue of being a selfish species, we have to be altruistic towards the group. I don't think that that's the case. I think that the only reason why we give any type of importance to the fact that we live in a social group, or why we even care about morals in the first place, is out of our own selfish sense of self-preservation.
Well, because we are objects of moral consideration and concern. So if we didn't exist, the whole moral thing would be out the window. Matter of fact, Mackey kind of argues that the error theorist, he kind of argued when I was reading that because we didn't discover moral facts empirically, we didn't discover them by like normal facts that we discover, right? He argues, facts don't exist, and of course he gets into the argument from queerness and error theory, but I still think it's the same as saying, look, 1 + 1 = 2, but you know what? If you don't want to use the reals, you don't want to use real analysis, okay, use some other field thing. Go talk about Godless theory, like that. Somebody had mentioned earlier today that they didn't understand at all what we were saying because we did a hangout on Godless theory. And so Galois, sorry, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Galois theory, and Galois theory basically is a way to step out of the reals. You're not using the reals anymore. You're in an entirely different field. And so then when they're saying, well, we can make 1 + 1 = 2, 3 or something, or 2 + 3 = 1. Well, yeah, but you're no longer in real analysis. You're dealing in a different framework altogether. together. That's the whole point of using Galois theory, that you're no longer using real analysis. So, but when we say 1 + 1 = 2, this is a market at us that means we assert that it is real analysis we're talking about. Just like when you say 1 + 1 = 2, you don't have to say, oh, and base 10 every time. There's an assumption in math that unless otherwise designated, you're talking about the reals.
So I think I have an answer to Shannon's question then,
Sure.
now that I think about that, is there are objective ways to achieve a desired outcome. Is there an objective way to determine what outcome should be strived for and why? I think that the objective outcome, that we're striving for is, like I said, it's that sense of self-preservation. That the entire concept of morality is about self-preservation.
And you think that's something that's universal, though, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something, that's universal. I think that that's something that, again, any rational person wants to value self-preservation. Every person wants to be able to walk down the street and not worry about being stabbed in the back and having everything taken from them.
All right, so if you because you hold a moral universalism, if that's true, if there are some moral facts that are ubiquitous among all cultures and among all people, that's kind of the position. Then you're saying moral facts exist, and they're something that does stem across all kinds of cultures, but they're not objective.
Moral facts exist only in the sense that their truthness is decided by whether or not a archetypical perfectly being would act in that way. So like a creature that was free of bias, free of judgment, that had the necessary amount of omniscience to come to a conclusion of something. The perfect judge, the ideal observer.
Ideal observer theory.
Yeah, like that. If an ideal observer would act in such a way, and the most important thing is like to call him like the perfect judge, or like to emphasize the unbiased aspect of this, is that the moral fact would be true only by definition. That's what an ideal observer would do.
Right. No, and I see some value to ideal observer theory. Real quick before I end this,
but again, like the reason why that's not a moral realist system is because it's completely dependent on
it's
the thoughts of it's completely dependent on the thoughts of an ideal observer.
Right. I know
moral facts that would exist independent of what the ideal observer would think.
Totally. So I totally get you. So because ideal observer theory and divine command theory both fall under ethical subjectivism. However, things like divine command theory, people will make that into an objective moral framework, even though it's contingent upon the will of God.
I just got to address one thing. The idiot on the external chat, I think that's how you say his name.
Yeah.
He says, what the ideal observer would do is good as a subjective statement, or subjective sentiment. Sorry. No. What the by definition? Have you ever heard like the Euthyphro's dilemma? Is something good because God does this, or something good because there's an external standard of God in which that he will appeal to? The ideal observer theory basically takes the first turn of the Euthyphro dilemma and says something is good by definition by virtue of the fact that the ideal observer would do it.
Right, rather than God.
Yeah, an ideal observer theorist throws himself in the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma and says that by definition, any action that the ideal observer does is good. So it's not a subjective sentiment.
But there's an arbitrary component to that, though.
Well, there's, it's a moral anti-realist system. It's a subjectivist position. So, yes, that is true. But like I said, that's, the only thing I'm correcting is that it's, that's not a subjective statement. It's, that's just that's how it's defined.
Yeah, like I said, I agree with you. I know that DCT and ideal observer theory does fall under moral anti-realism because it is ethical subjectivism. But okay, anyways, we've kind of bludgeoned through this enough.
Can I make a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was just want to say, I think maybe some of the disconnect with this conversation is that the people that are against the objective concept with morality, they're kind of looking at everything as a holistic system, where the ones in support of, the viewpoint that you and Socka are doing is because you're breaking the components down into its fundamental forms and processes that are going on, and you're looking at just the one component and saying, yes, this is absolute.
Oh, I totally agree.
This is objective, where the other people were just kind of looking at, because that's how I was doing it. I was
look at Brett. Here's the problem. All this stuff, you don't learn about it overnight.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing this for now years with Socka and learning about stuff and reading stuff and going to Google Books and going to Google Scholar and reading papers. Nobody's going to jump into this. And I've never heard any of this stuff and start making cogent arguments. It's just not going to work. And this is why, I say, I love when people have these discussions, especially when they're articulate, they're intelligent, people like Shannon, people like Gart, people like Socka and Ozzy. And we enjoy that because people listen and hopefully people glean, whether they believe we're right or wrong. Nobody in that discussion is fucking clueless, right? I mean, you just people arguing different positions. Some people say, well, I don't really side of that position. But when you get somebody who's never opened a book on the topic, never bothered to read upon the topic, and they come in and they start saying things like objective morality doesn't exist, that's when I just say I'm not interested. That's like a creationist going, hey, you know what? Evolution is bullshit. Well, what have you read about it? Oh, nothing. Then why are you wasting our time? Why is philosophy any different than science in that regard?
Exactly.
I want to answer the one last point from Shannon here, and that's the give me one objective ought, and I'll stand down. Okay. Shannon, unfortunately I can't help you because the nature of this conversation was to discuss the meta ethical view of moral realism, which is what I've done. I've tried my best, even as not a moral realist, to kind of explain to people, what the moral realist position is to the best of my ability. First off, if anybody disagrees with me or wants to make any corrections, Socka accounts, I'm easy to find. Send me a message.
It's easy.
I don't get, you can post in the GDC. I don't get offended at correction. Okay. The next thing is that the question that you're asking, Shannon, is a question about normative ethics, which is a completely different subject than what we're talking about right now. Yeah. So to dive into normative ethics, we're going to have to extend this for another 2 hours.
Yeah, and I don't want to go that route, and I understand that as well. That's why I say a lot of the stuff it borders on normative ethics, and when you're talking about normative ethics, it's a completely different ballgame. I for example, like Socka. I tend to go to virtue ethics, as you know, right? And virtue epistemology. I happen to like them, right? And so when people argue like things like doubt is a virtue, obviously I'm going to be going bullshit, right? I mean, that's just not a virtue in a virtue epistemology, either an epistemic virtue or a moral virtue. But that's normative, right? Normative is what you ought to be. When Shannon asks a question about oughts, you're automatically going to be defaulting into more normative ethics because that's what normative ethics deal with, oughts. And so it's a whole different ballgame from the meta-ethical type questions that we're talking about. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think the only thing, what I really like about virtue ethics, though, just going back to that point, is I love the idea of the golden mean.
Yes,
like that is. I think before when I was a moral realist, I like virtue ethics just by virtue of like that one thing where just like that true virtues lie in between two vices. I'm like,
the golden mean there is basically saying and I love this as well. For example, an epistemic virtue would be something like open-mindedness, right? So you don't want to have doubt because you don't want to doubt true things. So doubt is a vice in this here. You don't want to be believing everything because then you're gullible, right? Mm-hmm. You want to believe things that are true. So you want to be open-minded enough to believe things are true. So doubt is a vice. Gullibility is a vice. But that happy medium, that middle portion between the two of them that you strive for continually, you always go for it. You always want to be open-minded.
Yep.
That's how virtue ethics would work. Aristotelian ethics, it's also called. And I find that makes sense to me, right? I mean, look, no matter what you pick between two vices, you can always find a virtue between them and go, yeah, you know what? I want to be honest, but I don't want to be brutally honest. I want to be honest. I don't want to lie, right? So honesty lies in between those two things. I don't want to be a coward, but I don't want to be reckless. So courage lines between those things. So when it comes to doubt as a virtue, what do you think as a virtue ethicist would say, Socka?
Oh, I mean, the open-mindedness would be a good way to describe it. I'm not sure.
But what about doubt? Is doubt a virtue? Because doubt could not be a virtue.
Yeah, doubt wouldn't be a virtue. The same thing. It'd be like the same way that being a skeptic is good. Being a radical skeptic isn't. I'm fine with skepticism being
a virtue. If somebody wants to make that argument, I'm not really against that. It's not a classical one, but
a classical one would be courage. Okay, courage is a virtue, and on one side you have obviously cowardice, which is a vice, and on the other side you have recklessness, which is a vice. So people that are too courageous would be considered reckless. People that aren't courageous enough would be, cowardly. So
what do you go into more now? You more of a consequentialist or utilitarian type approach?
For normative ethics, more of a consequentialist, I think.
Let me ask you this, because people are still talking, and I see the problem right off the bat. But Lumet asks a great question, but you're going to see the problem with the question as soon as I ask it to you. Lumet says, I don't understand when people say objective morals exist. I had final classes and I learned about moral relativism. I don't think objective morals exist because of cultural relativism. And the easiest way to deflect that argument is that objective morality has nothing to do with those. The opposite of moral relativism and cultural relativism is cultural absolutism and moral absolutism, not objective morality. So using those against objective morality doesn't make sense. They're not the negation of objective morality. They're the opposite of absolutism. But what do you say, Socka?
I mean, I think that we addressed that enough in the classes.
Do you agree with that?
Sorry, what point do I agree with?
What I just said.
Yes.
Okay. So, that's the problem, Ed. When people talk about moral absolutism and moral subjectivism, especially moral relativism, it's just the opposite of moral absolutism, not moral objectivism. So that's the problem. But anyways, I will put the links to my blog in the video description. I also put the link to the moral descriptions from the Great Debate Community Wiki. In the video, hopefully those won't be enough to demonetize it. But YouTube has been really touchy lately. So anything else you want to add while I'm doing this real quick?
No, I mean I think that's.
I do appreciate you coming in, man.
Yeah, I think it was a good discussion. I'm hoping somebody that it kind of broadened people's kind of idea about what these things are, and by no means am I going to say that okay, well here guys, I've explained moral realism in the simplest way that I can, that I hope that people will understand it. And now all of a sudden become moral realists. That's not my goal at all. Like I said, I'm not a moral realist myself, but I just think that the representation of the argumentation isn't always the best. And again, if I can try to do a better way to explain it in the future, again, I'm open to correction on that. The one thing that I just want to stress is that when we talk about any given moral realist system, is that yes, there's always going to be a nature of your brain's going to be involved in the process, but that doesn't mean that it's subjective. And that regardless of what your meta-ethical system is, your meta-ethical system is assumed at the onset. So like a moral realist would argue against a cultural relativist by saying that, any culture that doesn't align with the moral realist views would obviously just be simply wrong, and they try to form some type of argument to say that they're wrong. But they're wrong only by virtue of the fact that they're assuming the moral realist position to begin with. Well, a moral anti-realist that would argue for cultural relativism would say that the moral realist is wrong. But again, you're only arguing by the point that you're already assuming the meta-ethical view that you came into starting with. It makes no sense to say that one is wrong or one is right, to bash heads on these ideas of meta-ethics.
I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree.
You start off with the meta-ethics, you build the framework, and then from there, we can grow on and we can move into normative ethics, and we can see, how this works or how we can derive the odds from there.
Yeah, and as long as somebody's consistent, I don't care if they're an anti-realist or a realist, as long as they have some kind of internal consistency, because there is no right or wrong answer, I don't think. There is no something to say, well, objective morals exist or objective morals don't exist. Yeah, it's all how you want to look at these things. And I think that the whole thing is bogged down in a quagmire of crap. And if you want to go watch a great video, go watch Sisyphus Redeems video on objective morality, and he's even frustrated with it. He's like, people use these terms all differently, even in the literature they're different. It's flawed from day one. It's kind of like the analytical and synthetic distinction, right? Most people are like, at this point, fuck it, right? It's just it doesn't matter at this point if there's an analytical distinction, an analytical synthetic distinction, a synthetic distinction. It's so bogged down in just nuance. It's lost any practical purpose, I think. That's just me. But anyways, Reds, you got brought back in. You want to say anything before we go off there?
No, we're good. We're good. Right. I think you all have said everything I would have said anyway.
Yeah, because you totally agree with me on everything. See,
totally.
He totally. No, we'll get into that another time. Anyways, thanks guys for watching. Shannon, by the way, we're going to have more of these discussions. I know you like them, so get your mic fixed or whatever the problem was and join us next time. You're more than welcome to, of course. And we'll see you tomorrow, I guess. Peace.